He was a cold-blooded killer who terrorized the Midwest, leaving behind 8 murders across 6 states. His name was Alton Coleman. Alton Coleman was born November 6, 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois. His mother, Mary Bates, was a prostitute who drank and did drugs throughout her pregnancy. Mary never wanted Alton and threw him in a trash bin, discarding him as garbage. Alton's grandmother, Alma, rescued him and decided to raise the boy. Alton still lived close to his mother, and neighbors recall hearing a small child being beaten by his mother with a chair and baseball bat. He was a middle school dropout, and it wasn't long before he gained a reputation with local law enforcement as a troublemaker. By the time he was 18, he had already been charged with multiple sex crimes. Alton met Debra Brown in 1983. She was a woman who was borderline intellectually disabled and diagnosed with a dependent personality disorder, meaning she was easily swayed by dynamic personalities. It was a match made in hell. It was the evening of May 29, 1984, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a community close to the Illinois border. A single mother named Juanita Weed arrived home with her 9-year-old daughter, Vernita. With them was their new friend, Robert Knight, who befriended Juanita a month earlier. They had just returned from a day of fun at a local carnival when Robert told Juanita that he had a belated Mother's Day present for her at his place just a few blocks away. He asked if little Vernita could help him carry it back. He promised it would only take an hour. Although she was reluctant at first, Juanita gave in to her daughter's excitement and let her go. As it approached midnight, Robert and young Vernita had not yet returned. Juanita was anxious about leaving her apartment to look for her daughter. If Vernita arrived to an empty home, the young girl might panic. But the worry became too great, and Juanita decided to go and find her daughter. When she arrived, her panic melted into horror. The building that Robert Knight claimed was his home was abandoned. Not knowing where else to turn, Juanita went to her friend Ellen Reeves for help. Concerned for the safety of her friend's daughter, Ellen insisted it was time to contact the police. A police officer asked Juanita to check mugshots for anyone who might look like Robert Knight. Juanita scanned 2 books of photos. Finally, she pointed to a picture of a man she was sure was Robert Knight. Officers determined that the person Juanita identified as Robert Knight was really named Alton Coleman. Investigators wasted no time in obtaining a search warrant for Coleman's last known address, his grandmother's house in Waukegan, Illinois, just a few miles across the state line from where the Wheats lived. A young woman answered the door, and when questioned by detectives, she identified herself as Debra Brown, Coleman's girlfriend. At first, Brown was reluctant to answer any questions about Coleman or his whereabouts. She said that she had been living at the residence for a year, providing home care for Coleman's nearly blind grandmother. When investigators persisted, they finally convinced Debra to cooperate. She told them that Coleman had been gone all night, but had come home alone at about 8 o'clock in the morning. He had come by to change into a suit for a court appearance later that morning. Coleman had been charged with raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point. Brown also admitted that Coleman had told her he had done something really bad the night before, but didn't explain what. The FBI joined forces with local investigators. The task force enlisted every available officer to help with the search for Coleman and Vernita. But Coleman managed to elude investigators, and on the night of June 19, 1984, 3 weeks after young Vernita's disappearance, investigators received a call from a man in Waukegan who was looking through an abandoned building for scrap metal to sell. And on the second floor of the wrecked apartments, he made a horrifying discovery. Laying on the bathroom floor was the badly decomposed body of Vernita Wheat. Alton Coleman, the FBI's prime suspect in the disappearance of Vernita Wheat, remained at large. At the autopsy to determine Vernita Wheat's exact cause of death, a television newscast caught the attention of detectives. A little girl had been found murdered in Gary, Indiana. The detectives immediately thought that there could be a connection to Coleman. The report also mentioned something that the detectives found disturbing. There were 2 killers, and the second suspect was described as being a black female. Investigators were right. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown traveled 90 miles from their home in Waukegan, Illinois. They were on the move, and they were leaving dead bodies along the way. At the hospital in Gary, Indiana, local authorities questioned 9-year-old Annie about the events on June 16, 1984. Annie told the officers that she and her 7-year-old niece Tamika were walking to the store when they were approached by a man and a woman riding bikes. The couple introduced themselves and told the little girls they had clothes that they might like. To retrieve the clothes, Annie and Tamika followed the couple into the woods. Annie was close to death when she managed to drag herself to the street. She was able to identify Coleman, but couldn't identify Brown from photographs sent by the FBI. However, the girl's description matched Brown's exactly. Now investigators were dealing with 2 killers. Detectives struggled to figure out Brown and Coleman's next move. Both murders occurred in largely black communities where the 2 could easily blend in, and they were quick to gain people's trust. To capture the serial killers, the FBI launched a massive national media campaign aimed at the black community. But the task force was always a step behind. On July 8th, agents received information from local Ohio detectives about an elderly woman named Rose Wiggins who reported her daughter missing. Rose explained that earlier in the day, she had come by to check on her daughter and found the door locked. Her young grandson was too frightened to open the door. The detectives convinced him that they were there to help. Now he had nothing to fear. Officers immediately began to search the house for the boy's missing mother. While they were looking, they found his 3-year-old brother, afraid, just like his older brother. Meanwhile, the 8-year-old told detectives about the man and woman who had been at their house. They showed him old photos of the suspects, Coleman and Brown, and he positively identified them as the couple who was there the night before. Searching the house for the boy's mother, the police found blood smeared throughout the kitchen. It led downstairs to the basement. Not knowing who or what awaited them, the investigators followed the grisly trail. The trail stopped where the bodies of mother and daughter were discovered, shoved into a crawl space beneath their home. The young boy recounted for investigators that his mother had met Coleman and Brown earlier in the day. They said that they had just moved to the area down the street. The couple stopped by the house and played with the kids. Virginia invited them to stay for dinner, and it was just like any other summer evening in the neighborhood. Virginia cooked while the kids hung out and chatted with their new friends. Eight-year-old James saw Coleman take a knife from the counter and slip it into his pocket. After enjoying dinner together, Coleman, Brown, and the young brothers settled into the living room to watch television. At the top of the evening news was a story of a pair of serial killers on the loose. Coleman immediately turned off the television and shuffled the young boys off to bed, while Kimberly and Virginia washed dishes. Aware of the growing media attention, Coleman realized he and Debra needed to change their look. He found some scissors and cut off his hair. Coleman, with Brown at his side, approached the little girl and her mother. Just upstairs, the young brothers were asleep. They dragged the slain woman and her daughter downstairs and stuffed them into a crawl space. With the national media spotlight focusing on the couple, it would be difficult for them to remain anonymous. Phone calls with sighting of Coleman and Brown poured in with more frequency and speed than ever before. On July 13th, local investigators responded to a frantic 911 call from a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Michelle Walters told officers what had happened that day. A couple arrived at the Walters house earlier that morning. They told Michelle's father, Harry Walters, that they were interested in buying his camper, which was for sale in the driveway. Harry's wife, Marlene, joined them on the porch. As Harry and Marlene chatted with them, Michelle left for work. When she arrived home later that day, Michelle noticed the bikes the couple had arrived in were still in the yard and her father's car was missing. Inside, she found her parents' home had been vandalized. She called out for her mother and father. Hearing no response, her mind began to race as she stepped through the shattered glass and overturned furniture littering the room. As she called 911, Michelle could hear a weak voice calling from another room. Next to the basement door, she noticed a bloody palm print. She walked down into the dimly lit room, not knowing what or who she might find. Lying next to each other, motionless on the floor, she discovered her parents. Her father, Harry, was barely alive. As she reached to take her mother's pulse, she lifted the sheet. Her mother, Marlene, was dead. Michelle waited by her father's side for help to arrive. Her parents had been bludgeoned and bound. Michelle's description of the couple that had stopped by her parents' house earlier that day matched fugitives Coleman and Brown. A forensic team went to work collecting evidence. Among the items was a pair of plastic shoes next to Marlene Stone. A recent sighting of the suspects included a description of Brown wearing these same shoes. Crime scene technicians also retrieved other bloody tools found around the bodies. Later forensics confirmed the crowbar was used to kill Miss Walters. The crime against the Walters showed that the couple could gain the trust of people outside of the Black urban communities where they had found their first 4 victims. This realization only complicated the investigation. Coleman could fit in anywhere. Though Coleman's rage continued to intensify, his ability to charm more victims remained consistent, and he was showing no signs of growing tired of the kill. A month and a half had passed since Alton Coleman and Debra Brown embarked on a killing spree that left 5 victims dead. An APB was put out on the vehicle the fugitives had stolen from the Walters. 2 days later, a farm worker discovered the abandoned car on his property in Lexington, Kentucky, 105 miles away from the crime in Cincinnati. In need of a new vehicle, Coleman and Brown assaulted Professor Carmichael in a hotel parking lot, forcing him to turn over his cash and car keys. Leaving the professor wounded but still alive, they sped away. An APB was issued for Carmichael's car. In a matter of hours, they received a response. It came from police from an Ohio town close to the Kentucky border. The professor's car was found abandoned behind some vacant buildings. Coleman and Brown were nowhere in sight. The FBI immediately set up a dragnet. Agents and police officers from across several states joined forces to track Coleman and Brown as they believed they would head back to Illinois. An officer in Dayton, Ohio, responded to a report involving an assault in a stolen car. The call came from an elderly couple, Reverend and Mrs. Gay. Reverend Gay had been badly beaten. Mrs. Gay told the officers that a young couple who they had met weeks earlier broke into their house. After beating them, the attackers demanded the keys to their station wagon. According to the description, the attackers were Coleman and Brown. Coleman and Brown were just out of reach, but the FBI was starting to close the gap. The day after the attack in Dayton, Ohio, detectives involved in the FBI dragnet discovered a station wagon that had been abandoned near a car wash in Indiana. It belonged to Reverend Gay. Later in the day, some road crew workers on the edge of Interstate 65 outside of Zionsville, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery. It was the body of an elderly man that had been reported missing from his home in Indiana. He was found on his 77th birthday. Evidence on the scene was unmistakable. Coleman and Brown had claimed another life. The body was found less than 20 miles away from the couple's home turf. The country's most wanted fugitive had come home, and the FBI was waiting for them. For 7 weeks, Coleman and Brown assaulted and killed victims in 6 different states. While investigators worked the crime scene, scores of local officers and agents organized a dragnet to trap them as they headed back home to Illinois. The aggressive media campaign was having an impact. And on July 20th in Evanston, Illinois, a man spotted Alton Coleman with Debra Brown in Mason Park. While he waited with the car running, his friend called the police. It was the one call that investigators had been hoping for. Evanston police responded. Now they were only a couple of yards from Coleman and Brown. With surprising ease, they were able to corner Coleman. He insisted that they had the wrong man. The second pair of officers surrounded Brown. When asked, she gave a different pair of names for herself and Coleman. Having found a knife in false identification, the officers brought Coleman to the police station. The search of Brown's handbag uncovered a .38 caliber pistol. The weapon was all they needed to handcuff her and take her in. Two of the FBI's most wanted were apprehended without incident. After nearly 2 months, the violent rampage was over. Coleman continued to insist that he hadn't been any of the places where the murders happened, but forensic evidence collected over the last 7 weeks proved otherwise. Alton Coleman was charged with the federal crime of kidnapping Vernita Wheat, followed by murder charges in 3 other states. Debra Brown was also charged for her role in the murders. As investigators from the task force looked on, a strip search uncovered a steak knife. It would be linked to yet another murder, a 15-year-old Ohio girl named Toni Story. Together, Coleman and Brown had stolen 8 lives. 3 states sought to take theirs. Brown stood trial separately. She was sentenced to death. However, in 2019, her sentence was commuted to life in prison. Until the end, she was committed to Coleman. In the end, Alton Coleman was sentenced to death. He was executed on April 26, 2002.